does it? A chain, 3 padlocks, 12 zip ties, 8 wire ties, 18 rocks, 6 layers of plastic and duct tape. Does this look like panic? I submit to you it looks like extreme calamity.
One night in June 2019, deep in the rural outskirts of Ohio, a search and rescue team arrived at an old, abandoned well. They didn't know exactly what they were about to find, but they had a feeling it would be something they could never forget. A beam of light pierced down nearly 30 feet into the earth, revealing a strange object resting at the bottom. 2 white plastic crates, zip-tied and chained together, sealed shut with a padlock and wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. It took the crew hours to hoist the crates up, and within minutes, the stench of decay rose thick in the air, choking everyone at the scene. Inside was the decomposing body of a tiny infant, Dylan James Groves, just 77 days old. A newborn who had once clung to life despite being born into addiction, only to be tortured and discarded by the very people meant to protect him, his own parents. Left to rot at the bottom of a cold, dark well, as if he had never existed at all. But this wasn't just a murder. It was a reflection of something even more chilling: the deadly cracks in America's child protection system, where one wrong decision can mean the end of a child's life. Dylan, who never got the chance to say mom or dad, became a symbol of justice delayed too long. In this series, we'll retrace Dylan's brief but harrowing journey, from his birth amidst heroin withdrawals to the hidden injuries on his fragile body and the system failures that allowed his suffering to continue unchecked. This isn't just a family tragedy, it's a national reckoning. If you believe in shining a light on real stories with depth and humanity, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and share this video, because sometimes one share isn't just about remembering a name, it's how we help a community learn the lessons it can't afford to ignore.
So, were you advised of any potential medical condition that Dylan had in this call to from Children's Services?
Yes.
What was your understanding of what you might be dealing with?
They told me that he was born with drugs in his system and that he was withdrawing and that he was, at that time he was 5 pounds 4 ounces, so he was really tiny. That's basically what they told me.
Dylan James Groves entered the world on January 10, 2019, in a delivery room at a small hospital in Scioto County, Ohio. His mother, Jessica Groves, arrived at the hospital nearly fully dilated. Nurses described her as agitated, uncooperative, and clearly high on drugs. The delivery was rapid, just 30 minutes from start to finish, and Jessica needed no pain relief. But what truly alarmed the medical staff was the fragile state of the newborn. Dylan was weak, breathing erratically, trembling, and had poor reflexes. Blood tests would soon reveal the horrifying truth. His tiny body was saturated with methamphetamine, amphetamine, fentanyl, morphine, heroin, and other opioids. A child barely hours old was already fighting to survive a war he had never chosen. Jessica tested positive for heroin as well, and later admitted she had used it throughout her pregnancy. As for Dylan's father, Daniel Groves, when informed of his son's dire condition, he merely nodded and left the hospital with Jessica after spending less than 15 minutes in the building. They didn't ask to hold their son. They didn't ask how he was. They didn't even stay long enough to name him. Because Dylan was born testing positive for narcotics, Scioto County Children's Services intervened immediately. Their initial plan was to place Dylan in the care of his biological father, Daniel, under the condition that Jessica live elsewhere and attend mandatory rehab. But the hospital refused to discharge Dylan into such an unstable environment. Instead, just 5 days after his birth, the fragile newborn was placed in temporary foster care. That's when Andrea Bowling came into the picture. She was a foster mother from nearby Portsmouth and agreed to take Dylan in. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found. Dylan was barely more than skin and bones, his limbs constantly twitching, his body soaked in sweat, his cries weak and strained. He was suffering from neonatal abstinence syndrome, drug withdrawal in a newborn. Andrea and her husband took turns holding him day and night. They didn't put him down for even a moment, because whenever they did, Dylan would scream until he was blue in the face. In those 12 short days, Andrea gave Dylan what he had never received before: warmth, comfort, and human touch. Then came the call she dreaded. On January 28, 2019, when Dylan was just 18 days old, Children's Services informed Andrea that Dylan was being returned to his biological father, Daniel Groves. Andrea protested with everything she had. She begged them to reconsider, warning them that Dylan was too fragile and that Daniel wasn't ready. Couldn't possibly be. But her pleas went unheard. Dylan was taken from her arms and returned to a home that offered no real protection, only isolation. That home was an old, worn-down mobile unit in rural Ohio. Jessica had entered a 3-week rehab program, and Daniel had agreed to take full responsibility for Dylan's care. For a brief period, Daniel kept up appearances, attending scheduled check-ins and communicating with caseworkers. But by mid-February, the cracks began to show. The couple started dodging appointments, phone calls went unanswered, doors stayed closed. Whenever a caseworker showed up, they were met with excuses. Dylan's sleeping, he's sick, he's with a relative. At first, the agency hesitated. There were no visible signs of abuse, nothing concrete to justify a forced removal. Then, all contact ceased. The last confirmed sighting of Dylan alive occurred on March 28, 2019, when caseworker Patricia Kraft paid a surprise visit. Daniel reluctantly let her in. Dylan was in a crib, smaller, thinner, and less responsive than before. There was a strange odor in the air, something that lingered even after Kraft left. But there was no physical evidence to act upon, no bruises, no blood. That would be the final time anyone outside the family would see Dylan alive. After that visit, he vanished. There were no new medical records, no scheduled pediatric visits. The family abruptly changed addresses, failed to notify authorities, and seemed to drop off the grid entirely. By April 30th, 2019, after more than a month of silence and mounting suspicion, Dylan James Groves was officially reported missing. Authorities, fearing the worst, removed Dylan's 14-year-old brother, Daniel Jr., from the home and placed him in the care of relatives for his own protection. The teenager would later become a crucial witness, but at that point, even he could only say, "My baby brother is gone." In May 2019, the Scioto County Sheriff's Office launched an official search. Deputies visited the Groves residence several times, often finding no one home. Neighbors claimed to hear crying some nights, but every time police arrived, the home was dark and silent. Then, on May 20th, officers spotted Jessica and Daniel fleeing their property on a four-wheeler, racing into the woods. A manhunt ensued, but the couple disappeared into the dense rural terrain. The failed pursuit heightened everyone's fears. A helpless infant had gone missing, and now the parents were on the run. Finally, on the morning of June 10th, 2019, officers obtained a search and arrest warrant. Law enforcement stormed the Groves mobile home. Jessica was quickly apprehended. Daniel locked himself inside for 6 tense hours before a SWAT team forced their way in and arrested him. In the interrogation room, after long silence, they spoke 3 chilling words: "Dylan is dead." No explanation, no emotion, no location of the body, just those words, flat and final. But until the boy's remains were found, no case could truly begin. And for Dylan James Groves, the full horror was still sealed inside something far worse than a lie.
Felonious assault, knowingly causing serious physical harm to baby Dylan. 4 counts. Rib fractures, significant calcification, 2-inch skull fracture, some healing, not as much as the rib fractures. 1-inch skull fracture, complete upper arm fracture, complete lower leg fracture, large chest contusion, swelling to his abdomen. Those are all separate counts because they're all separate injuries. There was nothing that came out of that witness stand that explained how those injuries could have all happened at one time. So you have multiple counts to consider.
2 days after the dramatic standoff, Daniel Groves finally began to talk. In a cold, detached tone, he offered a chilling clue. He's in the well. That was all it took. A single sentence that sliced through the silence of the interrogation room like a knife. On the night of June 12, 2019, a search team was dispatched to a remote area once part of an abandoned farm in rural Scioto County. There, hidden behind weeds and rotting boards, lay an old stone well. Nearly 30 feet deep, it descended into utter darkness. As rescuers shone their lights into the void, they spotted something heavy and unnatural at the bottom. 2 gray plastic storage containers chained together with metal links, wrapped in zip ties, sealed with padlocks, and weighed down by large rocks. It took hours of exhausting effort to haul the containers up from the deep. The moment the seal was broken, a stench of decomposition hit the air, so strong that seasoned officers had to turn away, retching. Inside, they found the severely decomposed body of a baby boy, wrapped in layers of plastic, duct tape, and a faded blanket. His tiny limbs were contorted, as though he'd been stuffed inside the container and sealed away like garbage. It was Dylan. Though everyone had feared the worst, the reality of seeing his remains, discarded like waste, was more horrifying than any nightmare. The autopsy was conducted that same night by Dr. Susan Brown, the Montgomery County coroner. A veteran of countless postmortems, even she stood stunned by the brutality she uncovered. Dylan's body showed extensive injuries, 2 skull fractures, a broken left forearm, both the radius and ulna, a fractured left tibia, and multiple rib fractures. Bruises covered his chest and legs. Most disturbingly, the fractures didn't occur at the same time. Some showed signs of partial healing, others were fresh. It was clear. Dylan had suffered at least 3 separate episodes of abuse during his short time with his biological parents. This wasn't an accident. It was a sustained, escalating pattern of violence. His brain tissue was discolored pink, a telltale sign of cerebral hemorrhaging, likely from repeated blunt force trauma to the head. Toxicology results found traces of methamphetamine and amphetamine in his system. Whether those were residual from birth or introduced later remains uncertain. Either way, they were secondary to what his body had endured. Dr. Brown classified his death as homicidal violence, a term used when the cause of death is clearly homicide, but the extent of decomposition prevents pinpointing an exact method. Was it head trauma, suffocation, overdose, or all of the above? The answer would never come. Dylan didn't die from a single blow. He died from the accumulation of pain, a slow unraveling of life under constant abuse. With Dylan's remains recovered, law enforcement finally began to piece together the full horror of what had occurred inside the Groves mobile home. Drawing from medical records, social worker logs, neighbor statements, and later testimony from Dylan's teenage brother Daniel Jr., a haunting picture began to emerge. A tiny infant, brutally abused, denied medical care, left to starve, his body fractured in stages, his cries ignored or silenced. When he finally stopped breathing, Jessica and Daniel Groves didn't panic. They didn't call 911. They didn't even check to see if he could be revived. Instead, they wrapped his body in plastic, sealed him in containers, chained and padlocked the boxes, and dropped him into a cold, forgotten well. To them, Dylan was not a son. He was a problem to dispose of. And for weeks, as he lay at the bottom of that well, the world moved on, unaware. The signs had been there, the warnings had been made, but no one acted in time.
They told me that you said he was dead. They told me he was on the They told me that you said he was dead. Wow. They told me that he was dead. I told him as far as I knew, CPS got back into me. They told me that he was dead. They knew better than I lying. So I told them, I said, well, I'm going to have to write everything silent. They told me that you told me you was dead. They told me you don't think that. That you don't do everything. They
What were you having? W pod? B pod?
I'm in a cell by myself.
I didn't know. She told me that she thought he was on W pod.
They told me that our faces were going to be all over the news.
Who told you that?
And that I was going to be the most hated woman
Who told you that?
in here, so they put me in a cell by myself to keep me safe.
Who told you that?
Jody. She said that your face, my face, and Dylan's face would be all over the news. That we were wanted for kidnapping and abduction, and they were looking for our little boy. And that we would be the most wanted people in Scioto County. So they were putting me somewhere safe so that the other women wouldn't, because I was going to be the most hated woman in this place. They took me up there yesterday while we did before we went to trap. And I took them some people in the place. For some reason, they were down for it. I was not very sad. I don't know where he's at. I don't think that's going to be trying to be. They said that he told me that I would know where he was at more than he.
From the very beginning, Jessica and Daniel Groves showed an unimaginable level of callousness toward their newborn son. At the hospital, they never once held Dylan. They didn't ask questions, didn't look back, and didn't even follow him into the NICU when he was rushed away for oxygen support. They stayed just 15 minutes, then left, abandoning their child to machines and silence. It wasn't a moment of panic. It was a sign of what was to come. When Dylan was returned to their care just weeks after birth, it should have been their chance to make things right. Instead, this drug-addicted couple resumed their spiral into violence and neglect. During the 2020 trial, their 15-year-old son, Daniel Groves Jr., testified that he had once seen baby Dylan's head swollen and bruised. When he asked his parents, they brushed it off with excuses. After that, they kept him away from his baby brother for weeks. The same boy revealed another disturbing truth. He had been asked multiple times to provide his father with his own urine so Daniel could pass court-mandated drug tests. This meant that Daniel had never truly stopped using. He had simply fooled the system, while Dylan paid the ultimate price. Dylan is believed to have died sometime near the end of March. But instead of calling for help, Jessica and Daniel chose something darker. They kept his lifeless body in their home for several days, then wrapped it in layers of plastic, locked it in a container, and dropped it into an abandoned well. The act was cold, calculated, designed not to grieve, but to erase. Throughout April and May, whenever social workers inquired about Dylan, the Groves had a ready lie. He's with family. They repeated the story again and again, never once faltering, even as Dylan's body lay hidden beneath the earth. By June, when they were finally arrested, the lies continued. In the interrogation room, both Jessica and Daniel insisted that Dylan had been picked up by child services, taken away along with their older son. But that too was false. The agency had already reported Dylan missing and had no idea where he was. When cornered, Daniel tried one last performance, pretending to be in withdrawal, collapsing onto the floor. Hours later, he admitted that Dylan was dead, but even then, he gave investigators a false location, sending the initial search into a dead end. Police weren't fooled. They used a common tactic, placing Jessica and Daniel in the same room with hidden microphones. Believing they were alone, the couple began whispering. Daniel muttered, "If they find the body and see the broken arm, we're done. We've got nothing left to lose." That slip, the fear of a broken bone being discovered, was everything investigators needed. Confronted with the recording, Daniel finally cracked. On June 12, 2019, he led police to the abandoned well. Inside it, they found Dylan's body, locked in plastic, chained shut, as if his death was meant to stay buried forever. Justice began to move. At the 2020 trial, Jessica and Daniel Groves chose to represent themselves. But their testimony did nothing to soften their image. If anything, it made them colder. Jessica, 39, admitted to causing Dylan's death, but she clung to one defense. It was an accident. According to her, on the night of March 27th, she accidentally dropped Dylan, resulting in serious injuries. He died the following morning. In panic, she and Daniel kept the body hidden at home, then disposed of it under the cover of night. "I didn't mean to kill my son," she sobbed on the stand. But when prosecutors pressed her about Dylan's older, partially healed skull fracture, evidence of earlier abuse, she refused to answer. Daniel, 41, took a different route. He denied everything. He claimed he had no idea Jessica had been hurting Dylan, and only realized something was wrong when he found the baby dead on March 28th. "Jessica told me they'd blame me because I had custody," he said, and so, afraid, he helped cover up the death. Daniel went further. He claimed he hadn't known Jessica was using drugs until after the baby was born, and said he only relapsed into addiction because he was depressed after their older son was removed in late April. But then, prosecutors presented a bombshell. In earlier statements, Daniel had admitted to seeing Jessica slam Dylan's head 4 times and grip his ribs tightly. Now on the stand, Daniel backpedaled. "I thought I was dreaming," he mumbled. They were words devoid of remorse, excuses steeped in denial. In the courtroom, observers were left speechless. Many wept. No one could fathom how 2 people who carried and birthed a child could treat him as nothing more than a disposable object. If the brutality of Jessica and Daniel Groves ignited public outrage for its sheer inhumanity, then the failings of the child protection system in Scioto County ignited something deeper. A bitter sense that the death of Dylan Groves wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a systemic failure. In court, multiple witnesses and officials admitted the truth. Scioto County Children's Services, SCCS, failed Dylan Groves at every critical turn. The first and most damning mistake was returning Dylan to his biological father far too soon. The infant, born addicted to multiple drugs, had only just completed a 12-day withdrawal period in foster care when he was sent home to Daniel Groves, a man with a history of drug addiction who had only recently tested clean. Andrea Bowling, Dylan's foster mother, had pleaded with officials to allow Dylan to stay in her care longer. She described how the baby trembled through the nights, soaked in sweat, desperate for stability and affection. She knew in her gut that sending him home was dangerous, but her voice was ignored. At trial, SCCS Director Laura Fuller claimed that Dylan was placed with Daniel under a status called temporary placement prior to reunification, meaning the agency still retained legal custody. But when asked why Dylan wasn't kept in foster care longer, Fuller refused to provide a specific reason, citing only that the matter was under internal review. The second and more haunting failure was a breakdown in supervision. Once Dylan was home, SCCS essentially lost track of him. Daniel began skipping court appointments, refused health checkups, and avoided in-home visits from caseworkers. Patricia Kraft, the social worker assigned to Dylan, testified that she attempted 3 home visits, but each time Jessica and Daniel offered excuses. The baby was sick, asleep, or not feeling well. They insisted everything was fine, and SCCS believed them. It wasn't until late April, when the couple vanished entirely, that Patricia finally filed a missing child report. She asked her supervisors to issue an Amber Alert, a national emergency alert for missing children, but her request was denied. The reason? According to testimony in court, if we issue an Amber Alert, it'll look like we lost a child. It would make the agency look bad. That single sentence captured a chilling truth. Public image had taken precedence over a child's life. As a result, for 5 weeks, no one outside the agency even knew Dylan was missing. No alert was issued, no press conference, no community search. Only on May 3rd did SCCS finally request police assistance, and it would take another 5 weeks before they obtained a warrant to search the Groves property. By then, Dylan had been dead for months. The consequences were irreversible. A fragile life had been lost, not only to parental cruelty, but to bureaucratic fear and silence. After Dylan's body was found, SCCS launched an internal investigation. The findings were devastating. Witnesses testified that the case had been mismanaged from start to finish, with protocols ignored and warnings missed. Director Laura Fuller herself admitted that her department was overwhelmed. Each caseworker, like Patricia Kraft, was responsible for up to 23 children, and at times as many as 31. She claimed, "With a caseload, that heavy, close supervision is nearly impossible." But that explanation didn't satisfy the public. In October 2019, Fuller was suspended from her role as SCCS director pending disciplinary review. For the people of Scioto County, the anger didn't stop with the Groves. Many placed blame squarely on the system that failed to intervene. They asked, what if Dylan had never been returned home? What if SCCS had acted faster? What if they had simply cared more than they feared? Dylan's death became a tragic symbol of the deadly cracks in the U.S. child welfare system, a reminder that when family reunification is prioritized above all else, the most vulnerable can pay with their lives.
In the case of State of Ohio versus Daniel Groves, case number 19 CR 586A. Jury has returned their verdict. Jury is to count 1, aggravated murder. May the jury, having been duly impaneled, find the defendant Daniel A. Groves not guilty of count 1 of the indictment, aggravated murder, a violation of Ohio Revised Code section 2903.01 CFA, being an unclassified felony. As to count 2, murder, the Jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, further find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 2 of the indictment, murder, a violation of Ohio Revised Code section 2903.02b-db, an unclassified felony. As to count 3, the jury has returned their verdict. We the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 3 of the indictment, kidnapping, in violation of Revised Code section 2905.01a5c1, being a felony of the first degree. As to count 4, juries return their verdict. We the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 4 of the indictment, endangering children, a violation of Revised Code section 2919.22a-e2c, being a felony of the third degree. We the jury, having found the defendant guilty, further find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant's violation did result in serious physical harm to Dylan Groves. Count 5 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 5 of the indictment, tampering with evidence, in violation of Revised Code section 2921.12a1b, being a felony of the third degree. As to count 6 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 6 of the indictment, interference with custody, in violation of Revised Code section 2919.23a1d2, being a felony of the fourth degree. Jury further found, we the jury, having been found the defendant guilty, further find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant's violation did result in physical harm to Dylan Groves. As to count 7, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 7 of the indictment, gross abuse of a corpse, in violation of Revised Code section 2927.01b and c, being a felony of the fifth degree. Count 8 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 8 of the indictment, felonious assault, a violation of Revised Code section 2903.11a2d1a, said offense being a felony of the second degree. Count 9 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 9 of the indictment, felonious assault, a violation of Revised Code section 2903.11a1d1a, being a felony of the second degree. As to count 10 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 10 of the indictment, felonious assault, a violation of Revised Code section 2903.11a1d1a, being a felony of the second degree. As to count 11, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Daniel A. Groves guilty of count 11 of the indictment, felonious assault, in violation of Revised Code section 2903.11a1 and d1a, being a felony of the second degree. As to the case of State of Ohio versus Jessica Groves, case number 19 CR 586B, the jury has, as to count 1 of the indictment, charge aggravated murder. The jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 1 of the indictment, aggravated murder, a violation of Revised Code section 2903.01c-FA, being an unclassified felony. As to count 2 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 2 of the indictment, murder, a violation of Revised Code section 2903.02b-db, being an unclassified felony. As to count 3 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 3 of the indictment, kidnapping, a violation of Revised Code section 2905.01a5c1, being a felony of the first degree. As As to count 4 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 4 of the indictment, endangering children, a violation of Revised Code Section 2919.22A(e)(2)c, being a felony of the 3rd degree. The jury, having been found the defendant guilty, further find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant's violation did result in serious physical harm to Dylan Groves. As to count 5 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 5 of the indictment, tampering with evidence, a violation of Revised Code Section 2921.12A1B, being a felony of the 3rd degree. As to count 6 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 6 of the indictment, interference with custody, a violation of Revised Code Section 2919.23A1D2, being a felony of the 4th degree. Jury further found, we the jury, having found the defendant guilty, further find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant's violation did result in physical harm to Dylan Groves. Count 7 of the indictment, jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 7 of the indictment, gross abuse of a corpse, a violation of Revised Code Section 2927.01 B and C, being a felony of the 5th degree. As to count 8 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 8 of the indictment, felonious assault, the violation of Revised Code Section 2903.11A1D1A, being a felony of the 2nd degree. As to count 9 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 9 of the indictment, felonious assault, the violation of Revised Code Section 2903.11A1D1A, being a felony of the 2nd degree. Jury is found, as to count 10 of the indictment, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 10 of the indictment, felonious assault, a violation of Revised Code Section 2903.11A1D1A, being a felony of the 2nd degree. As to count 11 of the indictment, the jury has found, we the jury, having been duly impaneled, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant Jessica Groves guilty of count 11 of the indictment, felonious assault, a violation of Ohio Revised Code Section 2903.11A1D1A, said offense a felony of the 2nd degree.
When Dylan's body was pulled from the bottom of the well, the case transcended the boundaries of a typical criminal investigation. It became a symbol of collective outrage. No one wanted to believe that a 2-month-old infant could be murdered by his biological parents and discarded like trash. But the deeper investigators dug, the colder the truth became. Soon after the discovery, the Scioto County Prosecutor's Office upgraded the charges against Jessica and Daniel Groves. The couple was indicted on 11 serious felony counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, child abuse, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, interference with custody, and multiple counts of felonious assault. Still, both Jessica and Daniel pled not guilty, which meant the case had to go to trial. In early January 2020, the courtroom at the Scioto County Court of Common Pleas opened its doors. Over the course of 4 intense days, witnesses were called one by one: nurses, pediatricians, foster mother Andrea Bowling, and key investigators like Lieutenant Jody Conkle, who had interrogated the suspects. Also testifying was Patricia Kraft, the social worker assigned to the Groves case. She choked up as she admitted her failed efforts to keep contact with the family and the fact that her request for an Amber Alert was shut down by superiors who feared it would reflect poorly on the agency. "We didn't want to look bad in the public eye," she recalled them saying. That single sentence struck a deep chord in the courtroom. One of the most heartbreaking testimonies came from Daniel Jr., the Groves' 15-year-old son. He revealed how his father repeatedly asked him to urinate into cups so Daniel could pass court-ordered drug tests. He also recounted seeing Dylan with a swollen, bruised head, and then, suddenly, he was never allowed to see his baby brother again. Physical evidence brought the courtroom to silence. Forensic experts displayed images of Dylan's corpse, showing a baby whose skull, ribs, arms, and legs had been broken, injuries sustained in at least 3 separate assaults. The room fell into stunned quiet when the expert described how the baby was wrapped in 6 layers of plastic, sealed with duct tape, chained in a plastic container, and then weighed down with rocks and thrown into a well. A volunteer firefighter described the harrowing task of retrieving the container from the deep, narrow well. The stench of decay, he said, still haunted him. Then came the bombshell, a surveillance audio recording of Jessica and Daniel whispering in their holding cell. They were caught planning how to blame each other if the body was ever discovered. "If they find the broken arm," Daniel murmured, "we're screwed. There's no turning back now." Confronted with this recording, the defense was forced to shift strategy. They admitted Jessica was primarily responsible for Dylan's death while portraying Daniel as someone who only helped cover it up. In court, Jessica broke down frequently, sobbing uncontrollably and forcing the judge to pause proceedings so her lawyer could calm her. Daniel, in contrast, remained expressionless, staring at the floor throughout the trial. This dramatic contrast led many to wonder, was Daniel truly a passive participant, or was this all an act? Whatever the case, the evidence was insurmountable. On the afternoon of January 10th, 2020, what would have been Dylan's first birthday, the jury reached a verdict after just 2 hours of deliberation. Jessica Groves was found guilty on all 11 charges, including aggravated murder. Daniel Groves was found guilty on 10 out of 11, acquitted only of the premeditated murder charge. The sentences were swift and absolute. Jessica received life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 32 additional years for the other charges. Daniel was sentenced to 47 years to life for his role in the murder, kidnapping, and disposal of the body. Jessica collapsed in sobs as the verdict was read. Daniel stood motionless, his face unreadable. And somewhere beneath the gray Ohio sky, a birthday that should have marked new life instead marked justice. The courtroom fell silent, not because the case was over, but because at last justice had spoken for Dylan James Groves. The horrific death of baby Dylan Groves sent shockwaves through both the local community of Scioto County and across the United States. The public was outraged not only by the unimaginable cruelty of the child's parents, but also by the fatal negligence of a child protection system that had failed to save him. Just 3 days after Dylan's body was recovered, on the night of June 13, 2019, the people of Scioto gathered for a candlelight vigil around the well where he had been discarded. Hundreds of candles lit up the night as silent mourners placed white flowers near a makeshift marker bearing Dylan's name. A quiet farewell to a lost child, and a resounding condemnation of the authorities that failed him. Grief soon turned into fury. Online, the hashtag #Justice for Dylan spread like wildfire, rallying people across the country to demand accountability and reform. Facebook groups were quickly formed, calling for systemic change and for those responsible to be held accountable. The case was no longer just about Dylan. It had become a symbol of a broken system that allowed countless other children to fall through the cracks. The media took notice. Major publications like the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post published in-depth articles dissecting the tragedy and asking painful questions. Dylan's parents passed a drug test. Was that truly enough to give them custody? One piece in KFF Health News detailed the agony Dylan endured from the moment he was born addicted to opioids, concluding that his death was not an isolated case, but part of a larger crisis in Ohio, where several children had died after being returned to homes plagued by addiction. Court TV aired full coverage of the trial, bringing the heartbreak and horror into living rooms across America. Viewers saw Jessica Groves sobbing hysterically in court and Daniel Groves sitting in eerie silence, head bowed. But their tears and silence only fueled public anger. The real target of outrage soon expanded to include the Scioto County Children's Services Agency. Citizens and journalists alike demanded answers. Why wasn't Dylan checked on more frequently? Why wasn't an Amber Alert issued? Who exactly was responsible for letting this happen? Public pressure forced action. In September 2021, more than 2 years after Dylan's death, 2 Child Protective Services workers were officially indicted. One of them, Lisa Thomas, who had handled Dylan's case, was charged with child endangerment due to negligence in her duties. Though the charges were limited, the decision marked a rare moment of accountability, an acknowledgement that those within the system could not be shielded from consequences. The case sparked a wave of societal debate around child welfare policies. One side argued that agencies were too eager to reunite children with biological families, even when those families had clear histories of substance abuse. Others pointed to underfunding and understaffing, with caseworkers often juggling 2 to 3 dozen files at a time. An impossible workload that prevented them from properly protecting vulnerable children. While opinions differed, everyone agreed on one thing: the system had to change. Dylan's story became a painful case study in how the opioid crisis and a failing safety net could destroy a life barely begun. His name continued to echo in crime podcasts, investigative reports, and reform efforts in the years that followed. Not as just another victim, but as a stark warning to a nation. Protecting children isn't just policy. It's a moral obligation. The tragic death of Dylan Groves didn't just stir public outrage. It catalyzed real legal momentum to prevent such horrors from happening again. In August 2021, Ohio State Senator Terry Johnson introduced Senate Bill 216, also known as Dylan's Law, named in memory of the baby boy whose short life exposed deadly cracks in the system. Dylan's Law aimed to protect newborns born into drug-affected households by tightening reunification protocols. Under the proposed legislation, any parent whose child is born with drugs in their system would be required to complete mandatory training on caring for infants with neonatal abstinence syndrome, participate in rehabilitation programs, and meet specific sobriety benchmarks before regaining custody. Even after reunification, parents would be subject to strict post-monitoring, including regular home visits, random drug tests, and ongoing caseworker oversight. The bill also called for increased funding and staffing for child protective services to ensure at-risk children are closely monitored, minimizing the chance of another child simply vanishing in the cracks. Dylan's Law quickly gained bipartisan support in Ohio. Co-sponsored by Senators Andrew Brenner and Jerry Serino, it sent a clear message. The safety of children must come first. Many hoped the law would close the loopholes that allowed Dylan's death, ensuring addicted parents couldn't regain custody too easily, and that caseworkers were held accountable for every decision they made. But as with many good intentions, Dylan's Law hit bureaucratic resistance. The bill stalled in committee, weighed down by concerns over funding, workforce availability, and logistical feasibility. As of 2025, the legislation had yet to pass, leaving advocates, families, and community leaders deeply disappointed. Still, Dylan's name has not faded. It continues to be invoked in legislative hearings and advocacy campaigns, standing as a visceral reminder to lawmakers. Don't forget the lesson written in blood. The Groves case also set off a chain of legal consequences that reached beyond Dylan. Just 1 year after his death, Scioto County was rocked again, this time by the killing of 5-year-old Annabelle Green, who was beaten to death by her paternal grandparents. Shockingly, the grandparents had been granted custody by the same Child Protective Agency, SCCS, and a caseworker who had handled Dylan's file was also involved in Annabelle's. 2 children dead, 2 cases tied to the same agency. Public outrage reached new heights. Under immense pressure, a special grand jury was convened to investigate whether criminal negligence had occurred within SCCS. In September 2021, 2 SCCS workers, Lisa Thomas and Renee Jin, were indicted on felony charges of endangering children, specifically in relation to their roles in the Dylan and Annabelle cases. It was a rare but significant move. Criminal charges against child welfare workers are exceedingly uncommon, even when their missteps have fatal consequences. But this wasn't just about legal precedent. It was about accountability. The indictment sent a powerful message. When a child dies under your watch, there is no immunity, no safe harbor in bureaucracy. When that plastic container was pulled up from the bottom of the abandoned well on a rainy night in June 2019, it didn't just contain the body of a child. It carried the wreckage of betrayed trust, a broken system, and a society that had looked away for far too long. Dylan James Groves, born into injustice, surviving violent withdrawal from narcotics passed on by his mother, only to be brutally abused and killed by the very parents who should have protected him. His death wasn't a single, isolated moment. It unfolded slowly, day by day, through neglect, deception, and the silent complicity of too many people. When foster mother Andrea Bowling stood in court and read a statement on behalf of Dylan, "You were perfect. You could have been anything." The entire courtroom fell silent. The tears shed weren't just for the lost innocence of one baby. They were for a collective horror, the realization that, in today's world, a child can slowly die unnoticed, even when the signs are plain to see. Dylan Groves became a wake-up call for America. His name became linked with stalled reforms, unfinished bills, congressional hearings, and hashtags full of grief. He represents thousands of children still living in unsafe homes, with parents who should love them, but end up destroying them instead. And the most terrifying question still echoes. How many more children are suffering in silence right now? How many more Dylans are crying behind closed doors? We can't bring Dylan back, but his brutal, unjust, and preventable death became a spotlight on the darkest corners of the child welfare system. From the courtroom in Scioto County to the legislative halls in Ohio, from TV broadcasts to the offices of child protection agencies, the name Dylan Groves rings out as a warning. If we don't change, there will be more blood. Dylan, a child who never truly knew happiness, sparked compassion in millions. He taught us that empathy cannot wait, that silence can kill, and that anyone can be the voice that saves a fragile life. He didn't live to see his first birthday, but he left behind a legacy, a message written in blood and tears. Never again let a child die at the hands of those who should protect them, surrounded by a community that chooses to stay silent.